me about jazz, partly because it's a massive topic all on its own, but mostly because I have literally no education or experience when it comes to music. Basically, I only listen to 80s stuff, Sigur Rós, Alan Watts lectures, and metal. So I'm not the person to speak on this topic whatsoever. However, there's a fantastic documentary on jazz's place in American history by Kenneth Burns. It's just called Jazz. Like, it's just jazz. It's up for free on the PBS streaming website if you're in the US. I am not. So I watched like 3 episodes on YouTube before they got nuked because I guess I'm just not allowed to know things, I suppose. But in the most reductive summary possible, jazz music was in the early 30s where hip-hop was in the early 90s. It had been around for a few decades in the black communities, had exploded into popularity with the introduction of new technology, introducing it to a wider audience, and was now so widespread it was showing up everywhere, and a lot of people were still really, really angry about it.
The thing that bothered the middle class, especially the white middle class, was that it seemed to be Africanizing American culture. The vulgar word would be it's niggerizing American culture. These people have you out here acting like niggers doing stuff. And that upset the white middle class terrifically. And it also upset the black middle class because the black middle class didn't want to be seen in this way.
But they also featured Don Redman, the Mills Brothers, Louis Armstrong, who was in New York by this time, and several others. Once again, to compare with Disney, which is not just me trying to make a point by comparing to Disney the whole time, Max Fleischer himself had some extremely strong opinions of Disney, and the Disney studio animators had some of their own opinions on the East Coast. But to compare to Disney's musical stylings and the one and only jazz song they ever put out during this time,
I'm the guy they call Mr. Mickey Mouse. Got a sweetie down in the kitchen house.
yeah, it's not exactly the message, is it? Okay, so that explains like the context of the people who made these shorts, but we now come to the part where I need to talk about the overall like zeitgeist of the time. The First World War came to an end in November of 1918. At the time, it was the most devastating conflict the world as a global society had ever faced. In modern day, World War II tends to get a lot of focus, mostly I think because World War II is one of the very few wars in history with very, very clear black and white good guys and bad guys. But I cannot overstate how traumatic and deeply the First World War cut into the global psychology in many ways that we still feel today, even if we're not aware that these problems are actually rooted in World War I and its aftermath and its the effects on society as a whole following the war. In 1930, the war had ended 12 years ago. Just to like hammer in, that is the same amount of time Bayonetta has existed. By this time, the war had happened long enough ago where filmmakers could start to try and process some of this global trauma. The American film All Quiet on the Western Front was released in 1930 exactly. One of the most important anti-war films of all time, told from the point of view of a 17-year-old German soldier. It won the Oscar for Best Director as well as for Outstanding Production, which I don't know if that's still an Oscar, I don't think it is. But it was really, really well received and is considered an extremely important film, especially when it came out.
I might also add, Mr. Lemley, that many of the great writers in magazines have asked this picture receive the Nobel Peace Prize of the year. And it's with great pleasure that I give you this presentation of the bronze statuette, which is an indication that the Academy, as well as the entire industry, consider that you've produced a real, epic, and fine achievement.
In 1933 came the film Gold Diggers of 1933, a movie about showgirls struggling to make ends meet in the Great Depression. You probably know the song from the movie if you know it at all.
We're in the money, we're in the money. We've got a lot of what it takes to get along.
This is our press rehearsal. We got a great show. It opens tomorrow night. You can't do this to me just because I don't pay a few bills. When the show opens, I will pay. Tell it to the sheriff.
The film directly compared the men at the unemployment lines to the men sent to die in the trenches during the final musical number, which is called Remember My Forgotten Man. At this point in time in film, there had been war films trying to process the First World War before this, but it was only around like the 1930s and like late 20s when people could really try and like work through that trauma and just how much damage the war had done. And now I have to talk about Dadaism, and I swear, I promise, this is not going to devolve into an art theory class, but we have to talk about Dadaism. Originally, I was under the impression that Dadaism was born directly and only following the First World War out of like cynicism, that humanity doesn't have any artistic integrity because they could allow something like the First World War to happen. This was information I got from Lindsay Ellis's video on Freddy Got Fingered, of all things.
It was started out of cynicism. They believed that any culture that could have produced such a horrible and human bloodbath like the First World War had no intrinsic value.
But it turns out this is like only partially true. It's kind of misleading because although the First World War did have a major impact on Dadaism and Surrealism, that whole cynicism, I'm not entirely sure where she got that information from because I couldn't find any sources that like said that, and discussing the art theory behind Dadaism, I never heard that brought up. Dada had been growing as an art movement years before the war began. Duchamp's Nude Descending a Staircase debuted in like 1912. However, it did gain massive traction after the war was over, as European artists started processing the full scope of the trauma the war had caused, especially in Europe. However, it's not so much an art movement out of post-war cynicism as it is a group of artists who were just sick and tired of how dictated the concept of high art had become. And we're trying to like deconstruct the concept of what art is at its core, so that it's no longer applied to massive works who could only be afforded by the bourgeoisie. The word bourgeoisie comes up a lot in like various Dada manifestos. And if art is nothing but a commodity for the rich to flaunt their wealth, then what the hell is art in the first place? And then Duchamp submitted a men's urinal to the Society of Independent Artists expedition in 1917, and it was accepted, and it's made people really, really angry to this day. It's really funny. Also, side note, in researching this video, I found out that Duchamp was like really based, and I recommend looking up interviews with him from like the 50s and 60s. Dude was pretty cool. Anyway, Dada is... It's a really confusing topic. Not that it's hard to understand, but it takes an age to properly explain what it really is about, especially when members within the art movement had like different definitions. And
It means no rules. Be as silly as you want.
Of an art movement, and that's not even mentioning the gatekeeping and like political alignment that was going on, and just the arguing. Like it was such a mess. Like I looking back on it and seeing the constant arguing and like what it means politically, and it in like the gatekeeping of no, oh, you can't do Dada because your parents were rich. Like there's so much of that, and it's probably because Dada is this concrete octopus of a concept that the
Did you
average
ever see
person
Monty Python's Flying Circus?
was much more welcoming to the art movement born
No.
out of
No,
Dada,
that's
and
kinda
that is
Dada.
Surrealism. So the big difference that makes Dada so confusing and Surrealism so much easier to just understand is Surrealism wasn't as focused on deconstructing art on a theoretical level as it was inspired by this brand new concept introduced to the common public by Sigmund Freud, and that was the subconscious. So dreams, urges, intrusive thoughts, suppressed emotions. You know, say what you want about Freud as a psychologist, and trust me, there's a lot you could say there. Freud made the concept of the subconscious into like a household word. The subconscious, that wasn't even really a thing. Freud was the one who kind of put that into the public's mind. And of course, the Dada artists of Europe, they ate that shit. up. This is when artists like Dali, who was already more or less involved with the Dada movement, completely blew up in both their actual artistic work as well as their popularity. And although Surrealism and Dada were concepts of Europe, New York especially was not as cut off from the European art scene as we in modern times tend to think of the dark days when nobody could talk to each other. America exported jazz to Europe, and Europe exported Surrealism to America, essentially. Now, the Fleischer shorts most people like to point at as an example of how creepy and weird cartoons of the 30s were is usually either Minnie the Moocher or Swing You Sinners. Now, Minnie the Moocher is about Betty Boop and her boyfriend Bimbo running away from home, and when doing so, encountering horrific and terrifying visions of criminals being put in the electric chair and kittens drinking from their mother until she shrivels up and dies, all while Cab Calloway sings the jazz number about a girl named Minnie who was in love with a man addicted to cocaine who introduced her to opium. And in Swing You Sinners, Bimbo tries to steal a chicken but is almost caught by a cop, and he tries to escape by entering a cemetery but is there confronted by various horrific imagery berating him for his crime before he goes to hell. So like, when people go, wow, 1930s cartoons really were just like that, or I hear people go, why are old cartoons so scary? It's like, because that's the point. They were trying to be scary. I'm not sure why you're getting confused here.
I don't know what possesses some people to create some of these animations, but a lot of these cartoons and animations are created for the sole purpose of entertaining children. And then you create one of the most horrific and demonic characters ever to put on a television screen that does nothing but traumatize the children.
About the ones like Batman or ones that were meant for older kids. I'm talking about the ones that were meant for little kids, and they probably should have been made for little kids. And when I say something is, wow, can you believe they did that for something that's meant for kids, I really mean adults and kids, because the idea was children can watch them as well.
How many little kids would actually understand what they're seeing?
I'm so surprised and shocked by how creepy cartoons from this era supposedly are. Why is there this preconceived mental image that these handful of examples from the earliest days of animation are weird outliers, or these freak cases that are at odds with animation as a whole? Because make no mistake, that is what you were saying when you emphasize how weird you find these cartoons. It says to me that your basis of comparison is perhaps scrubbed so clean that what's actually shocking to you is that animation can be something other than the tame, family-friendly content you automatically associate it with.
Yeah. I'm in the family business, and now you work for me, boomers!
But like I said, we're at the start of this. This example people like to use for really weird, creepy cartoons only fall between 1929 and 1934. So why is that? Well, 1929 was when Steamboat Willie came out, which was the first synchronized sound cartoon. I know I said, like, Fleischer did the synchronized sound with the sing-along ball, but Steamboat Willie, that is the one which took sound and applied it to an animated character. And then the Skeleton Dance came out the same year. But as for why this weird surrealist style of animation ended, that's thanks to this thing called the Hays Code.
This holiday season, instead of ho ho ho, it's